In the winter of 1798, a 12-year-old girl named Mercy Harrow vanished from the remote Kentucky wilderness, leaving behind only blood-stained clothes and a diary filled with the most disturbing confessions ever recorded on the American frontier. For over 2 centuries, historians have debated whether the events in those pages could be true, but recently uncovered court documents from the territorial government suggest something far more sinister than anyone imagined was happening along the dangerous wilderness trail. The diary reveals not just the story of a child bride's tragic fate, but evidence of a systematic murder operation that claimed the lives of at least 47 innocent families seeking new lives in the Western Territories. What makes this case particularly chilling is that Mercy Harrow wasn't just a victim. She may have been the only witness to one of the most prolific killing sprees in early American history, trapped in a nightmare where her own husband was the mastermind of unspeakable horrors. Before we continue with Mercy Harrow's story and the dark secrets buried along Kentucky's wilderness trail, I'd like you to hit that subscribe button and share in the comments what state or city you're tuning in from. This story shows that evil can hide behind the most charming faces, even in the places we call home. The tale begins not with murder, but with what seemed like an innocent romance that soon spiraled into one of the most chilling discoveries in frontier history. Kentucky in 1798 was a land caught between civilization and wilderness, where the promise of fertile farmland drew thousands of families westward along the notorious Wilderness Trail. This narrow, dangerous path cut through the Cumberland Gap, winding through dense forests and rocky gorges where travelers often vanished without a trace. The territorial government blamed most disappearances on hostile Cherokee raids, wild animals, or simple accidents. After all, the frontier was unforgiving, and death was a constant companion for those brave enough to seek their fortunes in the Western Territories. Cumberland County, where our story unfolds, was particularly isolated. The nearest territorial courthouse was 3 days' hard riding through treacherous terrain, and law enforcement consisted of a handful of appointed magistrates who rarely ventured beyond established settlements. This lawless landscape became the perfect hunting ground for those with darker intentions, where a man could make a family disappear without facing questions, and screams in the night were dismissed as nature claiming another victim. Into this harsh world 11-year-old Mercy Harrow arrived in the fall of 1797, orphaned after her parents died of fever during their journey from Virginia. She was traveling with the Caldwell family, distant relatives who reluctantly agreed to care for her until they could find her a more permanent home in one of the established settlements. But fate, or perhaps something far more sinister, had other plans for young Mercy. Even at her tender age, she was striking, with auburn hair that caught the firelight and green eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. She had an unusual intelligence, taught to read and write by her mother, skills rare among frontier children. These qualities, which should have been her greatest strengths, would soon become the tools of her entrapment, making her both an ideal victim and the perfect witness to horrors that would haunt her brief remaining days. Daniel Crenshaw appeared at their camp on a cold October evening like an answer to the Caldwell family's prayers. At 19, he was tall and broad-shouldered, with the easy confidence of someone who had survived the frontier. His dark hair was neatly trimmed despite the wilderness setting, his clothes well maintained, and most importantly, he spoke with the polished accent of someone educated back east. He claimed to be a professional guide who helped families navigate the dangerous passages to the fertile lands beyond the mountains. The Caldwells saw him as a godsend. "I've been guiding families through these trails for 3 years now," Daniel told them that first night, his voice warm and reassuring around the campfire. "Lost only 2 families to Cherokee raids, and that was early on before I learned all the safe routes. These days, I can get you through without seeing a single hostile face." What the Caldwells couldn't know was that Daniel Crenshaw had indeed been in the wilderness for 3 years, but not as a guide. He had been perfecting a far more sinister system of murder so efficient and well disguised that the territorial authorities never suspected the truth. The two families he claimed to have lost to Cherokee raids hadn't been victims of hostile natives. They had died by Daniel's own hand, their bodies disposed of in the wilderness while their possessions funded his increasingly elaborate schemes. Young Mercy first noticed Daniel watching her during the evening meal on his second day with their group. While the adults discussed routes and provisions, she felt his eyes on her with an intensity that stirred feelings she didn't fully understand. At 11, she had never experienced romantic attention, but there was something in Daniel's gaze that spoke to the part of her already maturing into womanhood. "You're quite different from most frontier girls," he said to her quietly as she helped clean the cooking pots by the stream. "You have learning. I can see it in how you carry yourself. Your parents taught you to read, didn't they?" Mercy nodded shyly, surprised by his attention. "Mama said education was the one thing no one could take from me, no matter how poor we became." Daniel smiled, and in the flickering light of the dying campfire, his expression seemed almost tender. "Your mother was a wise woman. Intelligence in a woman is a rare and precious thing out here. Most frontier families treat their daughters like livestock, but you could be something special." Those words planted the first seeds of Mercy's downfall. In a world where she had been treated as a burden since her parents' death, Daniel's attention felt like salvation. He began seeking her out for small conversations, asking about the books she had read and listening to her thoughts about their journey with what seemed like genuine interest. The Caldwell family, grateful for Daniel's guidance and eager to reach their destination before winter fully set in, failed to notice the subtle courtship happening right under their noses. They were too focused on survival to pay attention to how Mercy's eyes lit up whenever the handsome guide spoke to her, or how she began taking extra care with her appearance each morning. On the night of October 23, 1797, Daniel made his move not on the Caldwells, but on Mercy's heart. He approached her as she sat apart from the others, writing in the small journal her mother had given her before dying. "I've been thinking about something," he said, settling beside her on a fallen log. "The Caldwells plan to leave you with the Methodist mission in Lexington, don't they?" Mercy nodded, her heart sinking at the reminder. She had been dreading that moment for weeks. "That's no life for a girl like you," Daniel continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. "Those mission women will try to break your spirit, make you into another docile frontier wife, churning out babies for some farmer who can't even read his own name. What choice do I have?" Mercy asked, her voice barely audible. "I have no family, no money, nowhere else to go." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his words would seal both their fates. "You could come with me." The proposal that followed was everything a romantic 11-year-old girl could dream of. Daniel painted a picture of a life filled with adventure and purpose. She would be his partner in guiding families to safety, using her intelligence and education to help him keep detailed records of routes and weather patterns. They would travel together through America's most beautiful wilderness, building a life based on helping others achieve their dreams. "I know you're young," he said, taking her small hand in his larger one, "but frontier life makes adults of children quickly. You're already more mature than girls 3 years older who have lived sheltered lives back east. I can protect you, provide for you, and give you a purpose that makes use of your gifts." What Mercy couldn't see in the darkness was the cold calculation behind Daniel's romantic words. He had been watching her not with love, but with the predatory instincts of someone who recognized a perfect victim. Her intelligence made her useful, her orphaned status made her vulnerable, and her youth made her malleable. Most importantly, her education meant she could serve a specific purpose in his growing operation, keeping detailed records that would help him identify the wealthiest targets and plan their elimination with precision. The wedding took place 3 days later in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher Daniel claimed to have met on the trail. The Caldwells, relieved to have Mercy's future settled without the expense and trouble of delivering her to Lexington, gave their blessing readily and even contributed some of their precious supplies as a wedding gift, never suspecting they were funding the start of something monstrous. As Mercy Harrow became Mercy Crenshaw on that cold fall morning, she believed she was the luckiest girl on the frontier. Within 2 months, she was pregnant. Within 6 months, she would discover the true nature of the man she had married. And within 8 months, she would be dead, but not before recording the most terrifying account of systematic murder ever documented on the American frontier. The nightmare was about to begin. The first winter of Mercy's marriage passed like a dream. She would later describe in her diary as too beautiful to last. Daniel had built them a sturdy cabin in a secluded valley about 15 miles from the main wilderness trail, hidden among old-growth oaks and protected by steep rocky outcrops that made it nearly invisible to passing travelers. The location, he explained, was perfect for their guide service, close enough to the trail to intercept families needing help, but remote enough for privacy and safety. Mercy threw herself into the role of frontier wife with the enthusiasm of a girl finally finding her place in the world. She kept meticulous records in her neat handwriting, documenting weather patterns, noting which passes stayed clear of snow, and tracking the movements of game that indicated safe camping sites. Daniel praised her work constantly, telling her she was invaluable to their operation. "You have a mind for details most men lack," he would say, reviewing her careful notes by candlelight. "When spring comes and the heavy migration begins, we'll be the most successful guide service on the trail. We'll be able to pick and choose only the best families, the ones with real money to pay for quality service." During those long winter evenings, Mercy fell completely under Daniel's spell. An educated man who had attended college in Philadelphia before heading west, he shared with her books he claimed to have carried from his former life. They read together by the fire, Shakespeare's sonnets, Bible passages, even philosophical works gaining popularity among educated Americans. For a girl who feared she'd never again have access to learning, these evenings felt like paradise. The pregnancy began in December, and Mercy's joy was complete. At 12, she felt mature enough to handle motherhood, especially with Daniel's constant support and encouragement. He was tender with her during the difficult early months, preparing special teas to ease her morning sickness and rubbing her feet when they swelled from long days of walking. But small things began to trouble her as winter gave way to spring. Daniel would disappear for days at a time, claiming he was scouting routes for the coming season. But he never invited her to join him despite her knowledge of the terrain. When he returned, he always brought supplies: flour, salt, sometimes even luxuries like real coffee or white sugar. But his explanations for how he acquired them grew vaguer. Found a traveling merchant whose wagon broke down, he might say, or traded some furs to a Cherokee chief for safe passage. The stories never quite added up, but Mercy was too happy and trusting to question them seriously. The first family arrived at their cabin in early April 1798, just as the snows were melting from the high passes. The Harmons were traveling from North Carolina with their 3 children, seeking farmland in the bluegrass region around Lexington. They were exactly the type of clients Daniel had taught Mercy to expect: hard-working people with enough money to pay for professional guidance, but not wealthy enough to afford a large, well-armed escort. Mercy was excited to finally begin their legitimate guide service, but Daniel's behavior during the Harmons' 3-day stay struck her as oddly secretive. He spent long hours in private conversation with Mr. Harmon, asking detailed questions about their finances, planned destination, and route after leaving his service. He also insisted Mercy stay inside the cabin during most of their visit, claiming her pregnancy made it inappropriate for her to socialize extensively with male clients. "I'm protecting your reputation," He explained when she protested, "Frontier folks can be suspicious of a guide with such a young wife. They might think it reflects poorly on my judgment." The explanation made sense, but Mercy found herself watching from the cabin window as Daniel led the Harmon family toward the main trail. Something in his posture, an alertness she hadn't seen before, made her uneasy. When he returned 2 days later alone, claiming the family had decided to travel with another group they'd encountered, her unease deepened. "Did they pay you?" she asked, noticing he had acquired items she didn't recognize: a silver pocket watch, a woman's fine wool shawl, a child's wooden toy horse. "Of course," Daniel replied, but his voice carried a sharp edge she'd never heard before. "They were very generous, said my knowledge of the trail was worth every penny." That night, as Daniel slept beside her, Mercy lay awake listening to the forest sounds and trying to understand why her happiness felt so fragile. In her diary she wrote, "Something has changed in Daniel since the Harmons left. He seems different, more watchful. I tell myself it's just the stress of starting our business, but I can't shake the feeling there are things he's not telling me. I pray I'm wrong, for what would I do if the man I love isn't the man I believed him to be?" It was a question that would soon be answered in the most horrifying way possible. The second family arrived in late April, and Mercy's suspicions turned into genuine fear. The Pritchards were a wealthy merchant family from Richmond, traveling with 2 wagons loaded with expensive household goods and a strongbox Mr. Pritchard made no effort to conceal. They had hired Daniel specifically because his reputation as a reliable guide had spread among better-off immigrants heading west. But from the moment the Pritchards made camp near their cabin, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He insisted Mercy stay hidden entirely during their stay, claiming she was too ill with pregnancy complications to receive visitors. When she protested that she felt perfectly well, his response chilled her to the bone. "You'll do as I say, Mercy, without question. There are parts of this business you're too young and innocent to understand. Your job is to trust me and follow my instructions exactly." The tone was so harsh, so unlike the gentle husband she'd known, that Mercy obeyed without further argument. But her compliance didn't stop her from watching and listening from the cabin's single window as Daniel entertained their guests. What she observed over the next 3 days filled her with growing dread. Daniel asked the same probing questions he'd asked the Harmons, but with an intensity that seemed almost predatory. He wanted to know exactly how much money they carried, their travel plans beyond his guidance, and, most disturbingly, whether anyone back in Virginia expected regular letters from them during their journey. "We're hoping to settle quickly," Mrs. Pritchard confided during one evening meal Mercy could hear clearly from her hiding place. "My husband has letters of introduction to several businessmen in Lexington, and we're hoping to buy a large tract of land before winter." "Wise planning," Daniel replied, and even from a distance Mercy could hear something cold in his voice. "And no doubt your family back in Richmond will be eager for news of your safe arrival." "Oh, we have no family left in Virginia, Mr. Pritchard said with a laugh. "That's part of why we're making this move. We're free to start fresh with no one depending on us or expecting regular letters." That night, Mercy heard Daniel moving around outside the cabin long after their guests had retired to their wagons. When she peered through the window, she saw him examining the Pritchards' horses and wagons with the focused attention of someone taking inventory. The sight sent ice through her veins, though she couldn't yet articulate why. The next morning, Daniel announced he would personally escort the Pritchards through the most dangerous section of the trail, a narrow passage through Devil's Canyon, where Cherokee raids were supposedly common. He'd be gone at least a week, he told Mercy, and she was to stay at the cabin no matter what she heard or saw. "Promise me," he said, gripping her shoulders with painful intensity. "Promise me you won't leave this cabin for any reason until I return." Mercy promised, but as she watched Daniel lead the heavily loaded Pritchard wagons toward the canyon trail, every instinct screamed that something was terribly wrong. She spent the day pacing the cabin like a caged animal, her pregnancy making her movements awkward, but doing nothing to calm her agitation. Near sunset, she heard the first gunshot echoing from Devil's Canyon, then another, then screaming, high-pitched and desperate, cut short with terrifying abruptness. The sounds continued for about 10 minutes before fading into a silence that seemed to swallow the entire forest. Mercy spent that night huddled in the cabin with Daniel's hunting rifle across her lap, jumping at every sound from the darkness outside. When morning came with no sign of his return, she made a decision that would change everything. She would venture just far enough toward the canyon to see if she could figure out what had happened. The trail to Devil's Canyon was easy to follow, marked by the deep ruts of the Pritchard wagons and their horses' hoofprints. But about 2 miles from the cabin, Mercy made a discovery that stopped her cold. There, partially hidden behind a large boulder, was a camp clearly used regularly and recently. There were remains of multiple campfires, ropes used to tie people or animals, and, most damning, scattered personal belongings she recognized from families Daniel claimed to have guided successfully. A child's dress that belonged to one of the Harmon children, Mr. Pritchard's distinctive brass compass, a woman's wedding ring she was sure she'd seen on Mrs. Harmon's finger, but what she found hidden beneath a canvas tarp shattered her world completely. Daniel had been keeping trophies, not just valuable items, but personal mementos that told a story of systematic murder. There were locks of hair tied with ribbon, family photos, children's toys, and, most horrifying, a collection of final letters victims had apparently been forced to write before their deaths. One letter, in a woman's shaky handwriting, read, "To whoever finds this, my name is Margaret Harmon, and we were murdered by our guide, Daniel Crenshaw, on April 12, 1798. He promised safe passage but led us into an ambush. He is not alone. Tell our families in North Carolina that we died loving them." As Mercy stood there with the evidence of her husband's true nature scattered around her, she felt the baby kick inside her and realized the full scope of her nightmare. She was carrying the child of a monster, trapped in the wilderness with no one to turn to and nowhere to run. But perhaps most terrifying, she understood why Daniel had been so eager to marry her and why he valued her intelligence and education so highly. She was his record keeper, his accountant of murder. Every detail she'd carefully documented about weather patterns and trail conditions was used to plan the perfect conditions for killing. Every note about family finances and travel plans was intelligence that helped him select the most profitable victims. Mercy Crenshaw wasn't Daniel's beloved wife. She was an unwitting accomplice to mass murder, and she was running out of time to decide whether she'd continue in that role or find a way to stop him before he killed again. The sound of approaching horses told her that decision time had come sooner than expected. Mercy barely had time to cover the evidence and scramble back toward the cabin before Daniel appeared on the trail, leading the Pritchards' horses but notably without the Pritchards themselves. His clothes were mud, stained, and there were scratches on his face, but he carried himself with the satisfied air of a man who'd completed a successful deal. "Mercy," he called out with forced cheerfulness as he spotted her on the trail. "What are you doing out here? I told you to stay at the cabin." "I heard gunshots," she replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I was worried about you. Where are the Pritchards?" Daniel's expression darkened for a moment before returning to its practiced warmth. "Cherokee raid, just as I feared, happened so fast there was nothing I could do. I barely escaped with my life, had to hide in the rocks for 2 days before I was sure they were gone." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that Mercy realized he'd told this story many times before. But now she knew what to look for and could see the calculation in his eyes as he gauged whether she believed him. How terrible, she managed to say, did they suffer? It was quick, Daniel said, his hand moving unconsciously to the knife at his belt. "That's all we can hope for in this wilderness." As they walked back to the cabin together, Mercy's mind raced through everything she'd seen and heard over the past months. the suspicious supplies Daniel brought back from his scouting trips, his detailed questions about clients' finances and family connections, the way he'd insisted she stayed hidden from view, and now the evidence near Devil's Canyon proving he was systematically murdering families who trusted him with their lives. But what terrified her most was the realization that Daniel wasn't working alone. The evidence pointed to a larger operation, and she began to understand why he'd married her. A young, pregnant wife provided the perfect cover for a man whose business required him to appear trustworthy and settled, who would suspect a devoted family man of being a cold-blooded killer. That evening, as Daniel sorted through the Pritchards' belongings with the casual efficiency of long practice, Mercy made another chilling discovery. In her sewing basket, hidden beneath balls of yarn, she found a small leather journal she'd never seen before. When she opened it while Daniel was outside tending the horses, she found page after page of meticulous records in his neat handwriting. The journal was a ledger of murder. Every family Daniel had guided over the past 3 years was listed with details of their financial worth, planned destinations, and the methods used to kill them. The Harmons had been shot during a staged Cherokee attack. The Pritchards had been poisoned with hemlock extract and then finished off with knives to make their deaths appear violent. But the final entries made Mercy's blood run cold. Daniel was planning to kill her right after the baby was born. In his calculations, a crying infant would be a liability that could attract unwanted attention, and a wife who'd seen too much was an even greater risk. He'd already crafted a story to explain her disappearance. She'd die in childbirth, a common enough occurrence on the frontier that no one would question it. The journal also revealed the scope of his operation. Daniel was part of a network of at least 6 men working different sections of the Wilderness Trail, sharing information about wealthy targets and coordinating attacks to avoid suspicion. They had killed at least 47 families over the past 3 years, amassing a fortune in gold, jewelry, and valuable goods converted to cash through contacts in New Orleans and Charleston. As Mercy sat reading the documented evidence of mass murder, she felt the baby kick violently inside her, as if responding to her terror. She was 7 months pregnant, isolated in the wilderness with a man who planned to kill her in 2 months, and she had no idea how many other killers might be nearby. But perhaps most terrifying, she realized someone was watching her read the journal. Through the cabin window, she could see a figure moving in the tree line, someone Daniel hadn't told her about, someone who'd been observing their cabin for who knew how long. Just when it seemed the horror of Mercy's situation couldn't intensify, it did. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries, hit the like button to support this content, and subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in this nightmare that consumed the Kentucky wilderness. When Daniel returned to the cabin that night, Mercy forced herself to act normally despite the journal hidden beneath her mattress. But she noticed he kept glancing toward the window, and she realized he was communicating with whoever was watching from the forest. The net was closing around her, and she was running out of time to save not only her own life, but also that of her unborn child. The next morning brought new horror. A 4th family was approaching their cabin, and from Daniel's reaction, Mercy knew they wouldn't survive the encounter. The Carver family arrived on a crisp June morning, and Mercy immediately knew they were walking into a death trap. John Carver was a prosperous lawyer from Charleston, traveling with his pregnant wife, 2 young daughters, and a wagon loaded with law books, fine furniture, and a chest that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins when unloaded. Daniel's eyes lit up when he saw their wealth, but Mercy also noticed something else. Hand signals exchanged between her husband and figures moving through the trees around their cabin. The network was mobilizing for what would clearly be their most profitable kill yet. "Mr. Carver," Daniel said with his most charming smile, "you've come at the perfect time. I know exactly the route to get your family safely to Lexington, and with 2 pregnant ladies to consider, we'll take extra precautions." As the family set up camp near the cabin, Mercy fought a desperate internal battle. She had spent weeks planning how to escape Daniel's control, but never imagined she'd be forced to watch innocent people walk toward their deaths. The Carver children, aged 8 and 10, played near the stream while their parents discussed travel plans with Daniel, completely unaware they had perhaps hours left to live. The eldest Carver daughter, Sarah, reminded Mercy painfully of herself at that age, bright, curious, full of questions about the world. Sarah had approached Mercy earlier that morning, fascinated by meeting another young wife on the frontier. "Are you really only 13?" Sarah asked with the innocent directness of childhood. "Mama says I won't be ready for marriage for years, but you seem so grown up and wise." Those words cut through Mercy like a knife, reminding her how quickly innocence could be destroyed on the frontier. She looked at Sarah's trusting face and saw herself 8 months earlier, believing in Daniel's promises and dreaming of a romantic life in the wilderness. Throughout the day, Mercy watched Daniel work his deadly charm on the Carver family. He regaled them with stories of successful journeys, showed them carefully drawn maps, and discussed the safest routes through Cherokee territory with the authority of someone who genuinely guided families to safety. His performance was so convincing that even Mercy, knowing the truth, momentarily believed the fiction. But she also noticed subtle preparations for murder. Daniel's scouting trips around the camp were reconnaissance missions to identify the best attack positions for his accomplices. His detailed questions about the family's finances were intelligence, gathering for the theft that would follow their deaths, and his insistence on leaving early the next morning was designed to get them away from the cabin before other travelers might witness what was about to happen. That evening, as both families shared a meal around the campfire, Mercy made her decision. When Mrs. Carver complimented the stew and asked for the recipe, Mercy saw her chance. "I'd be happy to write it down for you," she said, reaching for her journal, "but I should mention I use a special herb that only grows in certain parts of these mountains. Let me show you where to find it." Daniel shot her a sharp look, but Mrs. Carver's enthusiasm seemed harmless enough. As Mercy led the pregnant woman toward the stream under the pretense of gathering herbs, she whispered urgently, "You must listen to me carefully. Your lives depend on it, Mrs." Carver's face went pale as Mercy quickly explained what she discovered about Daniel's true profession. At first, the woman thought Mercy was suffering from pregnancy-induced hysteria, but when Mercy showed her the hidden journal pages she'd torn out and hidden in her apron, Mrs. Carver's disbelief turned to terror. "My God," Mrs. Carver whispered, her hands shaking as she read Daniel's meticulous records of murder. "How many families? How long has this been happening?" 3 years at least," Mercy replied, her voice barely audible above the stream. "Maybe longer. Your family isn't just random victims. Daniel chose you because you're wealthy, traveling alone, and no one back in Charleston expects regular letters." Mrs. Carver's face crumpled as the implications hit her. "The children? Oh God, what about my children? We have to warn my husband," she whispered. "No," Mercy said firmly, gripping the woman's arm. "Daniel's not alone. There are at least 3 others watching us right now. If you act suspicious, they'll kill everyone immediately. We need a different plan." The plan that followed was born of desperation and courage that only emerges when faced with absolute evil. Mercy had spent months studying Daniel's operation, learning his signals and methods. She knew his network relied on coordination and timing, and if she could disrupt either, she might create enough confusion to give the Carvers a chance to escape. "Listen carefully," Mercy whispered. "Daniel will suggest leaving at dawn, taking you through Devil's Canyon, where the attacks usually happen. But tonight, I'm going to create a diversion. When you see the signal fires, take your family and run toward the main trail. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't trust anyone you meet until you reach the territorial militia post at Boonesboro. What about you?" Mrs. Carver asked, her eyes filling with tears as she looked at Mercy's swollen belly. "I can't run," Mercy said simply, "but I can give you time." That's all that matters now. What followed was the most desperate gambit of Mercy's young life. She convinced Mrs. Carver to return to camp and act normally while she made her final preparations. That night, as the adults settled down to sleep and Daniel prepared for what he believed would be an easy kill, Mercy put her plan into motion. She had studied Daniel's journal and knew his method relied on surprise and victim isolation. But she'd also noticed the killers were superstitious, fearing anything that might attract territorial authorities. If she could create enough noise and confusion, they might decide the risk was too great and abandon their plan. At midnight, Mercy crept from the cabin, moving with the careful stealth Daniel had taught her during their months together. Her pregnancy made her movements awkward, but adrenaline and desperation gave her strength she didn't know she had. First, she made her way to where the Carvers' horses were tied, quietly leading them to a hidden grove she'd prepared earlier. Then came the most dangerous part of her plan. Using flint and steel from Daniel's supplies, she began lighting a series of signal fires she'd prepared throughout the days. Small piles of dry kindling arranged in the pattern Daniel's network used to communicate authorities approaching. First fire caught quickly, sending orange flames dancing against the night sky, then the second and the third. Within minutes, the valley was illuminated by warning fires visible for miles. The effect was immediate and chaotic. Daniel burst from the cabin to find his wife missing, the client's horses gone, and signal fires burning in what appeared to be a warning that law enforcement was closing in. In the darkness and confusion, he couldn't tell if Mercy had been taken by his own men or had somehow escaped on her own. "Mercy!" He roared into the night, his voice carrying the rage of a predator whose plans had been disrupted. "What have you done?" But Mercy was already moving to the next phase of her plan. While Daniel and his hidden accomplices tried to understand what was happening, she crept back toward the Carver camp, where Mrs. Carver was awakening her family and preparing them for flight. "The horses are waiting in the grove beyond the creek," Mercy whispered urgently. "Follow the stream until you see the white stone marker I left, then turn east toward the main trail. Come with us," Mrs. Carver pleaded, but Mercy shook her head. "Someone has to stay to keep them confused. If we all disappear at once, they'll know what happened and track you down. This way, they'll waste time looking for me first." The next few minutes were a heart-stopping dance of stealth and terror as the Carver family crept through the darkness toward safety. 8-year-old Mary Carver stumbled over a fallen log and cried out in pain, the sound echoing through the forest like a gunshot. Suddenly, Daniel's voice roared through the darkness, find them all, no witnesses." What followed was a deadly game of cat and mouse through the Kentucky wilderness with a heavily pregnant 13-year-old girl guiding a terrified family to safety while killers closed in from all directions. Mercy's intimate knowledge of the terrain gave her an advantage, but Daniel knew her too well and could predict where she'd go and how she'd think. The chase lasted until dawn, with the sounds of pursuit growing closer each hour. Daniel's men had spread out through the forest, using hunting calls to coordinate their movements as they systematically searched every possible hiding place. Several times, the Carvers came within yards of discovery, saved only by Mercy's quick thinking and knowledge of hidden caves and animal paths. But exhaustion and her advancing pregnancy finally forced them to take shelter in a cave she discovered months earlier during her explorations. The Carver family huddled in the darkness while Mercy kept watch, her diary clutched in her hands as she wrote what she believed would be her final words. "If we are found, I want it known that Daniel Crenshaw and his men have murdered at least 47 families on the Wilderness Trail. They are not Cherokee raiders or common bandits. They are organized killers who use the frontier's isolation to prey on innocent families seeking new lives. I pray someone will find this record and bring them to justice, for I fear we will not live to see another sunrise." But sunrise brought an unexpected sight, a column of territorial militia riding hard up the main trail, led by Captain James Whitfield, who was following reports of signal fires and suspicious activity in the area. The authorities Daniel feared had been approaching all along, drawn by reports from other travelers who'd noticed an unusual number of abandoned campsites and scattered belongings along the trail. As the militia surrounded Daniel's cabin and began their investigation, Mercy faced the most difficult decision of her life. She could reveal everything she knew and ensure the killers faced justice, but doing so would expose her role as an unwitting accomplice and likely lead to her own arrest or worse. In the end, the choice was made for her when Daniel, realizing capture was inevitable, decided to eliminate the only witness who could tie him to the murders. As the militia closed in, he came for Mercy with a knife, determined that if he was going down, he'd take his pregnant wife with him. "You've destroyed everything," he snarled as he cornered her near the cave entrance. 3 years of careful work, ruined by a stupid little girl who couldn't mind her own business. The final confrontation was brief but brutal. Daniel's rage made him careless, and Mercy had prepared for this moment during the long night of running and hiding. As he lunged at her with the knife, she grabbed one of his own pistols, a weapon she'd learned to use during their months together on the frontier. The shot that followed echoed through the Kentucky mountains like thunder, bringing the militia running toward the sound. They found Daniel Crenshaw dead and Mercy Harrow dying, her hands still clutching the weapon that had ended one of the most systematic murder operations in frontier history. The final pages of Mercy's diary, found clutched in the hands of a 13-year-old girl who died protecting not only the Carver family, but also the evidence that would expose one of the most systematic murder operations in frontier history, became the foundation for the most significant criminal investigation in early Kentucky Territory history. Captain James Whitfield, a veteran of Indian warfare who'd seen his share of frontier violence, wrote in his official report that he'd never encountered anything as methodical and cold-blooded as Daniel Crenshaw's operation. The physical evidence was overwhelming once investigators knew where to look, and Mercy's detailed documentation provided a roadmap that led to discoveries far beyond what anyone had imagined. The hidden camp near Devil's Canyon yielded the remains of dozens of victims, carefully buried in unmarked graves that would have stayed hidden forever if not for Mercy's courage. The stash of stolen goods found at the site was worth an estimated $15,000, an enormous fortune for the time, representing the life savings of families who'd sold everything to start fresh in the Western Territories. But perhaps most chilling was Daniel's meticulous record-keeping, which revealed the true scope of his network's activities. Every family murdered over the past 3 years was documented with clinical precision. Their names, ages, financial worth, and the specific methods used to kill them. The records showed a level of organization that shocked even hardened militia officers, with detailed maps of attack sites, schedules coordinating multiple killers, and backup plans for disposing of evidence if primary methods failed. Mrs. Carver's testimony, delivered through tears before a packed courthouse in Lexington, painted a vivid picture of Mercy's final hours. She described how a pregnant child risked everything to save a family of strangers, using intelligence and courage that belied her years. The testimony was so powerful that several jurors wept openly, and the courtroom erupted in applause when she finished. The investigation following Mercy's sacrifice led to the arrest of 7 men involved in the network, though authorities suspected at least 3 others escaped to other territories before they could be caught. Under interrogation, the captured killers confessed to systematic murders spanning multiple states and territories, revealing an operation far more extensive than anyone had imagined. The network had been operating for at least 5 years, not 3, as Daniel's records suggested, killing families throughout Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, and the Carolina territories, always careful to spread their activities across jurisdictions to avoid detection. The total number of victims was estimated at over 70 families, more than 300 100 men, women, and children who had simply vanished into the American wilderness. The methods were as varied as they were brutal. Some families were poisoned with plant extracts mimicking natural illnesses. Others were shot during staged Indian attacks with victims scalped to make the murders look authentic, and still others disappeared without a trace, their bodies disposed of in the wilderness while their possessions were sold through criminal contacts in major cities. The trial that followed became one of the most sensational criminal cases in early American history. Families of victims traveled from across the eastern states to witness justice being served, and newspaper coverage reached as far as Boston and Philadelphia. The 7 surviving killers were hanged in Lexington on September 15, 1798, before crowds numbering in the thousands. But more importantly, Mercy's diary led to sweeping changes in how territorial governments approached frontier law enforcement. The case exposed dangerous gaps in communication between jurisdictions, allowing criminals to operate across territorial boundaries without detection. New protocols required regular reports between territorial militias, and a system of wanted notices was created to track suspected criminals across state lines. Regulations were introduced requiring all professional guides to be licensed and bonded through territorial authorities, with mandatory check-ins at established outposts along major migration routes. Families traveling dangerous passages were given coded signals to request help, and militia patrols were increased significantly in remote regions where murders had occurred. The wilderness trail itself was transformed by these changes. Guard stations were set up at key points along the route, and travelers were required to register their passage and report their safe arrival at designated checkpoints. The system, while not perfect, made it nearly impossible for another operation like Daniel's to succeed. The impact extended beyond law enforcement. Churches throughout the frontier began organizing support networks for orphaned children, recognizing that Mercy's vulnerability had made her an ideal victim for Daniel's manipulation. The Methodist mission in Lexington, where Mercy was originally meant to be placed, established new protocols for placing orphaned children with carefully vetted families rather than leaving them in institutional care. The Carver family, whose lives were saved by Mercy's sacrifice, dedicated themselves to ensuring her story wouldn't be forgotten. John Carver used his legal expertise to help draft many of the new laws protecting frontier travelers, while his wife, Sarah, set up a fund providing education and support for orphaned children throughout the Kentucky Territory. 3 months after their escape, Sarah gave birth to a daughter and named her Mercy in honor of the girl who died so her child could live. That daughter, Mercy Carver, grew up knowing her namesake's sacrifice and dedicated her life to establishing schools for frontier children, ensuring other orphaned girls would never be as vulnerable as Mercy Harrow had been. The physical location where Mercy made her final stand became a shrine for travelers on the Wilderness Trail. For decades, families stopped at what became known as Mercy's Cave to leave flowers, children's toys, or small tokens of remembrance. Local Cherokee leaders, long blamed for murders Daniel committed, participated in these memorial ceremonies to honor a girl who cleared their name through her sacrifice. Modern historians estimate the true number of victims may have been far higher than documented. Daniel's network had been evolving, becoming more sophisticated in selecting targets and disposing of evidence, with plans to expand to other major migration routes like the Great Indian Warpath through Virginia and the Federal Road through the southeastern territories. Recovery efforts continued for years as investigators used Daniel's records to locate additional burial sites and identify remains, providing closure to families across the eastern states who'd lost relatives to the wilderness. The case also exposed broader criminal networks supporting such operations. Daniel's group had connections with corrupt merchants in New Orleans, Charleston, and Richmond who helped convert stolen goods into cash. These investigations led to further arrests and revealed a level of organized crime authorities hadn't suspected existed on the frontier. Yet, despite the historical significance of her sacrifice, Mercy Harrow remains largely forgotten by mainstream American history. Her story survives mainly in regional archives, court records, and family documents, overshadowed by broader narratives of Western expansion and frontier heroism. Perhaps this reflects the uncomfortable truth her story reveals, that even in America's earliest days, when communities were small and neighbors supposedly knew each other, the most dangerous predators were those who exploited trust and vulnerability. Mercy Harrow's tragic story reminds us that heroism can come from the most unlikely sources, sometimes from a frightened, pregnant 13-year-old girl who found the courage to choose justice over survival when innocent lives hung in the balance. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was uncovered, or are there still secrets buried in the Kentucky wilderness? Share your thoughts in the comments about how such crimes could have gone undetected for so long. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The frontier may be gone, but the lessons from Mercy Harrow's sacrifice remain as relevant today as they were over 2 centuries ago. See you in the next story.